Good afternoon and welcome to a hybrid House Foreign Affairs Committee hearing. In accordance with House rules and regulations, the host will mute all participants. Please keep yourselves muted when not speaking. If you do not remember to mute yourself after speaking, the host will do so to limit background audio. A timekeeper will monitor the time for this hearing. For submission of documents during this hearing, please email hvac.repository@. As a reminder, members must have their video on to be recognized. Madam Chair Meeks, please count down from 5 and pause so the system recognizes your video and you're ready to go.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The Committee on Foreign Affairs will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length of in the limitation of the rules. To insert something into the record, please have your staff email the previously mentioned address or contact full committee staff. As a reminder to all members, please keep your video function on at all times, even when you are not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves. Consistent with House rules, staff will only mute members as appropriate when they are not under recognition to eliminate background noise. Where's the secretary? We're now waiting to bring up the secretary so that we can see him.
I'm here, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Before I make my opening remarks, Mr. Secretary, thank you, number one, for being here. And this is the importance, given this topic and the importance of this topic, and this committee's constitutional responsibility of oversight, I wanted to ask you whether or not you would be willing to stay to answer all member questions. We want all members to have the opportunity, knowing that this is the first time that we're having some testimony in regards to pulling out since the August 31st of this year. Would you have the ability to stay to answer all members' questions?
Mr. Chairman, I'm prepared to stay until every member's had an opportunity to ask a question. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. We thank you for that. And I see that we have a quorum, and I now will recognize myself for opening remarks. Pursuant to notice, we meet today to evaluate the United States withdrawal from Afghanistan and the series of policies from the past 20 years that led to the events of August 2021. Mr. Secretary, it is good to have you back here before our committee, a third time since you've been Secretary. And thank you, and we appreciate your recognition of the important role this legislative body plays in conducting oversight on the executive. And I want to start off today by citing some numbers. 800,000. That's the number of Americans who served with the U.S. military in Afghanistan since 2001. 2,461. That's the number of American military personnel who died in Afghanistan, including the 13 brave Americans who were killed facilitating the evacuation of 124,000 people over the course of 17 days. 66,000, the number of Afghan national security forces killed in the conflict. 47,245, that's the number of Afghan civilians killed since 2001. 20, That's the number of years we have been fighting in Afghanistan. A war that has gone on for almost 20 years is a disaster. Disentangling ourselves from the war in Afghanistan was never going to be easy. And for my friends who presume a clean solution for the withdrawal existed, I would welcome hearing what exactly a smooth withdrawal from a messy, chaotic 20-year war looks like. In fact, I've yet to hear the clean withdrawal option because I don't believe one exists. Now, are there things the administration could have done differently? Absolutely yes, as always. Foremost for me is for the State Department to evaluate how it could better evacuate Americans when events unravel quickly. And I look forward to hearing from the Secretary how the State Department intends to complete its evacuation of the 100 to 200 Americans remaining in Afghanistan who want to come home, as well as for evacuating those Afghans who worked alongside us during the past 20 years. However, it is important to separate fair criticism from criticism that isn't made in good faith and divorced from the realities on the ground in Afghanistan. We've heard some criticize the decision to close Bagram, which they claim would have been better suited for evacuations, as though it would have been easier to evacuate hundreds of thousands of people from an airfield 40 miles outside of Kabul. Others criticize the decision to not keep a small counterterrorism force in the country. I ask, where was this protest when the Trump administration sidelined the Afghan government in order to cut a deal with the Taliban? Where was the protest when the Trump administration negotiated a deal with the Taliban just 1 month after the abduction of Navy veteran Mark Frericks? And where was this protest when then President Trump and Secretary Pompeo agreed to withdraw all troops by May 21st, 2020? And let me remind everyone that Trump's deal forced the Afghan government to release 5,000 prisoners and offered international legitimacy to the Taliban. It was a deal that failed to require the Taliban to separate from al-Qaeda terrorists and did not require the Taliban to stop attacking the Afghan government. The deal altered the political order of the country. Now, some may say Trump's agreement was conditions-based, but it was different, that it came with stronger conditions. But that's simply not true. The choice before President Biden was between a full withdrawal and the surging of thousands of Americans to Afghanistan for an undefined time. To argue that there was a third option, a limited troop presence where the safety of our personnel could be preserved, in my mind, is a fantasy. Had we not removed American troops from Afghanistan, we would have left them in the middle of a rapidly deteriorating war zone with no assurances that they would be spared by the Taliban. And it strikes me that many of those critical of the administration's evacuation efforts are really just angry that the president made good on his pledge to end America's involvement in the war in Afghanistan. They are masking their displeasure with criticism but fail to offer feasible alternatives. Once again, we are seeing domestic politics injected into foreign policy. The Taliban's quick takeover of provinces, Afghan security forces laying down their arms, and President Ghani's abrupt departure from the country he led, watching 20 years of effort crumble in only a matter of days, has made it all the more clear that we could no longer occupy Afghanistan and that the president's decision to bring our troops home was the right one. And for me, as I closing this chapter of the U.S.-Afghanistan book is a difficult one. I voted to authorize the war back in 2001, after the terrorist attack on September the 11th. In the 20 years since, I've seen how this conflict cost the lives of countless Americans, Afghans, and our NATO partners. And what makes this all the more difficult is this is a war that should have ended 19 years ago with a different outcome. But our hubris, our own desire to remake Afghanistan, our own willingness to negotiate got in the way of that victory. These are hard truths, but only by examining these hard truths will we be able to understand what went wrong in Afghanistan. The task before us on this committee, one that I'm committed to making, will explore the past 20 years, but we'll be talking to individuals from the Bush administration, from the Obama administration, from the Trump administration, as well as the Biden administration. And I now recognize Mr. McCall for his opening statements.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the Secretary also for agreeing to stay until every member has been heard. I believe every member has a right to ask questions on such an important topic. Over the last several weeks, we witnessed Afghanistan rapidly fall to the Taliban and the chaotic aftermath that followed. This did not have to happen, but the president refused to listen to his own generals and the intelligence community, who warned him precisely what would happen when we withdrew. This was an unmitigated disaster of epic proportions. I never thought in my lifetime that I would see an unconditional surrender to the Taliban. For weeks, our offices were flooded with requests to help people get out of Afghanistan, requests that were coming to us because the State Department failed to provide help. And then the unimaginable happened. On August 26, 13 American servicemen and women were brutally murdered by ISIS-K trying to help American citizens and our Afghan partners escape from the Taliban. 2 days ago, we commemorated the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And while we mourn the loss of almost 3,000 innocent people, the Taliban at the same time celebrated by raising their flag over the presidential palace. Days before, they emblazoned their flag on the wall of our United States Embassy, proclaiming the defeat of the United States of America. Shockingly, the White House has described this Taliban regime as businesslike and professional. So let's meet a few of these professionals, the so-called new and improved Taliban. The acting prime minister, Mullah Hassan Akhund, one of the Taliban's founding leaders. He is also sanctioned by the United Nations and sheltered Osama bin Laden for years. The infamous members of the Taliban Five released from Guantanamo under the Obama administration also all hold senior positions in the new government. And finally, the worst, acting Interior Minister Haqqani. He is responsible for overseeing policing and counterterrorism. He's also wanted by the FBI. He is the head of the brutal Haqqani network with close ties to al-Qaeda and is currently sanctioned by the United States. Most of the new and improved Taliban leaders hold the same or similar positions they held prior to 9/11. And we are now at the mercy of the Taliban's reign of terror, all while a dark veil of Sharia law covers Afghanistan. The freedoms our troops help secure for Afghan women and girls have been stripped away in a matter of weeks. This, in my judgment, is not only disgraceful, it also dishonors the men and women who served our nation so bravely. Mr. Secretary, the American people don't like to lose, especially not to the terrorists. But that is exactly what has happened. This has emboldened the Taliban and our adversaries. The Taliban, a designated terrorist group, now equipped with American weapons than most countries in the world. Just a few weeks ago, thousands of terrorists, the worst of the worst, were all released from prisons as the Taliban overran the country. The situation we find ourselves in is far worse, in my judgment, as a former chairman of Homeland Security Committee, far worse than pre-9/11. To make matters worse, we abandoned Americans behind enemy lines. We left behind the interpreters who you, Mr. Secretary, and the President both promised to protect. I can summarize this in one word: betrayal. The America I know keeps its promises. The most important promise in our military is no man left behind, no one left behind. But you broke this promise. Unfortunately, it wasn't the only promise this administration broke. In April, President Biden promised, quote, "We will not conduct a hasty rush to the exit, and we will do it responsibly, deliberately, and safely." But that promise was broken. And then in July, the president said, quote, "There's going to be no circumstance where you see people being lifted off the roof of the United States Embassy in Afghanistan." That promise was also broken. Our standing on the world stage has been greatly diminished. Our enemies no longer fear us, and our allies no longer trust us. And our Afghan veterans are questioning if their sacrifice was worth it. For those veterans who are watching this today, I have a message for you. Your service was not in vain. It is because of your heroism that we have not witnessed a large-scale attack by the terrorists since 9/11 in the last 20 years. And for that, I say to all of you, thank you. And so we are here today to better understand how this administration got it so wrong. And I hope you will directly answer our questions, Mr. Secretary, succinctly, because we have quite a few. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now turn to the chair of the Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and Nonproliferation, Ami Bera, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for coming before the subcommittee. Obviously, this is not going to be an easy hearing. There'll be a lot of questions back and forth. And we certainly, over the course of the next few months at the subcommittee and full committee level, will do some of our oversight on the information and so forth that decisions were made on. I want to focus, though, on the mission that's still at hand. You know, my district has the largest Afghan refugee population in the country. We've submitted over 10,000 names of U.S. citizens, visa holders, family members, et cetera. And, you know, that mission still remains. I've got close to 30 school-age kids that are still in Afghanistan, U.S. citizens, visa holders, along with their parents. And we've got to do everything we can to get those folks to safety. And I look forward to working with you, your staff, and others to make sure we don't leave folks behind and we get those folks out as reasonably as possible to safety. And I look forward to the testimony. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Chair Bera. I now turn to the ranking member, Mr. Shabbat, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, this administration's bungled pullout from Afghanistan just may be the worst foreign affairs disaster in American history. You've essentially surrendered that country and its people to the good graces of the Taliban, and the Taliban doesn't have good graces. Afghanistan is once again a haven for terrorists, and those terrorists now have our weapons and equipment to use against us. As Mr. McCall correctly stated, our allies may well not trust us as much, and our enemies may not fear us as much. Yes, the majority of the American people wanted to leave Afghanistan, but not like this. Pulling our troops out before civilians, abandoning Americans, enemy, as well as thousands of Afghans who worked with us and fought with us and their families, and leaving half the population, about 20 million women and girls, to be brutalized once again by the Taliban. This is a disgrace. And I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Shabbat. Now I'll introduce our witness. Secretary of State Antony J. Blinken was sworn in as the United States Secretary of State on January 26, 2021. And as I mentioned in my opening statement, This will be the third time Secretary Blinken testified before this committee, and we are grateful for his appearance before us today. I'll now recognize the witness for his testimony, which I understand will be a little longer than 5 minutes, but being that he's going to be here for all of our questions, I think it's important for his statement to be heard in its entirety. Secretary Blinken, I now recognize you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member McCall, thank you for today. I welcome this opportunity to discuss our policy on Afghanistan, including where we are, how, and where we're going in the weeks and months ahead. For 20 years, Congress has conducted oversight and provided funding for the mission in Afghanistan. I know from my own time as a staff member for then Senator Biden how invaluable a partner Congress is. As I said when I was nominated, I believe strongly in Congress's traditional role as a partner in foreign policy making. I'm committed to working with you on the path forward in Afghanistan and to advance the interests of the American people. On this 20th anniversary of 9/11, as we honor the nearly 3,000 men, women, and children who lost their lives, we're reminded why we went to Afghanistan in the first place: to bring justice to those who attacked us and to ensure that it would not happen again. We achieved those objectives long ago. Osama bin Laden was killed in 2011, a decade ago. Al-Qaeda's capabilities were degraded significantly, including its ability to plan and conduct external operations. After 20 years, 2,641 American lives lost, 20,000 injuries, $2 trillion spent, it was time to end America's longest war. When President Biden took office in January, he inherited an agreement that his predecessor had reached with the Taliban to remove all remaining forces from Afghanistan by May 1st of this year. As part of that agreement, the previous administration pressed the Afghan government to release 5,000 Taliban prisoners, including some top war commanders. Meanwhile, it reduced our own force presence to 2,500 troops. In return, the Taliban agreed to stop attacking U.S. and partner forces and to refrain from threatening Afghanistan's major cities. But the Taliban continued a relentless march on remote outposts, on checkpoints, on villages and districts, as well as the major roads connecting them. By January 2021, the Taliban was in the strongest military position it had been in since 9/11, and we have the smallest number of troops on the ground since 2001. As a result, upon taking office, President Biden immediately faced the choice between ending the war or escalating it. Had he not followed through on his predecessor's commitment, attacks on our forces and those of our allies would have resumed, and the Taliban's nationwide assaults on Afghanistan's major cities would have commenced. That would have required sending substantially more U.S. forces into Afghanistan to defend themselves and prevent a Taliban takeover, taking casualties, and with at best the prospect of restoring a stalemate and remaining stuck in Afghanistan under fire indefinitely. There's no evidence that staying longer would have made the Afghan security forces or the Afghan government any more resilient or self-sustaining. If 20 years and hundreds of billions of dollars in support, equipment, and training did not suffice, why would another year, another 5, another 10? Conversely, there is nothing that our strategic competitors like China and Russia, or adversaries like Iran and North Korea, would have liked more than for the United States to re-up a 20-year war and remain bogged down in Afghanistan for another decade. In advance of the President's decision, I was in constant contact with our allies and partners to hear their views and factor them into our thinking. When the President announced the withdrawal, NATO immediately and unanimously embraced it. We all set together on the drawdown. Similarly, we were intensely focused on the safety of Americans in Afghanistan. In March, we began urging them to leave the country. In total, between March and August, we sent 19 specific messages with that warning and with offers to help, including financial assistance to pay for plane tickets. Despite this effort, at the time the evacuation began, there were still thousands of American citizens in Afghanistan, almost all of whom we evacuated by August 31st. Many were dual citizens living in Afghanistan for years, decades, generations. Deciding whether or not to leave the place they know as home was an incredibly wrenching decision. In April, we began drawing down our embassy, ordering non-essential personnel to depart. We also used this time to significantly speed up the processing of the special immigrant visas for Afghans who had worked for us and by our side these past 20 years. When we took office, we inherited a program with a 14-step process based on a statutory framework enacted by Congress and involving multiple government agencies, and a backlog of more than 17,000 SIV applicants. There had not been a single interview in the SIV program in Kabul for 9 months, going back to March of 2020. The program was basically in a stall. Within 2 weeks of taking office, we restarted the SIV interview process in Kabul. On February 4th, one of the very first executive orders issued by President Biden directed us to immediately review the SIV program, to identify causes of undue delay, and to find ways to process SIV applications more quickly. This spring, I directed significant additional resources to the program, expanding the team in Washington of people processing applications from 10 to 50, and doubling the number of SIV adjudicators at our embassy in Kabul. Even as many embassy personnel returned to the United States under order of departure, we sent more consular officers to Kabul to process SIV applications. As a result of these and other steps, including working with Congress, by May, we had reduced the average processing time for special immigrant visas by more than a year. Even amid a COVID surge at Embassy Kabul in June, we continued to issue visas. And we went from issuing about 100 special immigrant visas per week in March to more than 1,000 per week in August, when our evacuation and relocation efforts began. That emergency evacuation was sparked by the collapse of the Afghan security forces and government. Throughout the year, we were constantly assessing their staying power and considering multiple scenarios. Even the most pessimistic assessments did not predict that government forces in Kabul would collapse while U.S. forces remained. As General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has said, nothing I or anyone else saw indicated a collapse of this army and this government in 11 days. Nonetheless, we planned and exercised a wide range of contingencies. Because of that planning, we were able to draw down our embassy and move our remaining personnel to the airport within 48 hours. And the military, placed on standby by President Biden, was able to secure the airport and start the evacuation within 72 hours. The evacuation itself was an extraordinary effort under the most difficult conditions imaginable by our diplomats, by our military, by our intelligence professionals. They worked around the clock to get American citizens, Afghans who helped us, citizens of our allies and partners, and at-risk Afghans on planes out of the country and off to the United States or to transit locations that our diplomats had arranged and negotiated in multiple countries. Our consular team worked 24/7 to reach out to Americans who could still be in the country, making in those couple of weeks 55,000 phone calls, sending 33,000 emails, and they're still at it. In the midst of this heroic effort, an ISIS-K attack killed 13 service members working the gates at HKIA, wounding 20 others, and killing and wounding scores of Afghans. These American service members gave their lives so that other lives could continue. In the end, we completed one of the biggest airlifts in history, with 124,000 people evacuated to safety. And on August 31st in Kabul, the military mission in Afghanistan officially ended, and a new diplomatic mission began. I want to acknowledge the more than 24 countries that have helped with the relocation effort. Some served as transit hubs, some welcoming Afghan evacuees for longer periods of time. And I want to recognize the extraordinary efforts by Congress as well. To name just a few examples, Congressman Fitzpatrick worked with the State Department to reunite an Afghan family in New Jersey. Congressman Keating worked with our folks on the ground to help a Voice of America reporter and his family get to the airport. Congresswoman Jacobs and Congressman Issa worked across party lines to draw attention to cases of legal permanent residence and Afghans at risk. Please know your emails, your calls made a real difference in getting people out, and we continue to use the lists and information you're providing in the next phase of the mission. Let me now just briefly outline what the State Department has done over the last couple of weeks and where we're going in the days and weeks ahead. First, we moved our diplomatic operations from Kabul to Doha, where our new Afghan affairs team is hard at work. Many of our key partners have joined us there. Second, we're continuing our relentless efforts to help any remaining Americans, as well as Afghans and citizens of allied and partner countries, leave Afghanistan if they so choose. This past Thursday, Qatar Airways charter flight with U.S. citizens and others on board departed Kabul and landed in Doha. On Friday, a second flight carrying U.S. citizens and others departed Afghanistan. These flights were the result of a coordinated effort by the United States, Qatar, and Turkey to reopen the airport and intense diplomacy to start the flights. In addition to those flights, a half dozen American citizens, about a dozen permanent residents of the United States have also left Afghanistan via an overland route with our help. We're in constant contact with American citizens still in Afghanistan who have told us that they wish to leave. Each has been assigned a case management team to offer specific guidance and instruction. Some declined to be on the first flights on Thursday and Friday for reasons including needing more time to make arrangements, wanting to remain with extended family for now, or medical issues that precluded traveling last week. We'll continue to help them, and we'll continue to help any American who still wants to leave, and Afghans to whom we have a special commitment, just as we've done in other countries where we've evacuated our embassy and hundreds or even thousands of Americans remain behind. For example, in Libya, in Syria, in Venezuela, in Yemen, in Somalia. There is no deadline for this mission. Third, we're focused on counterterrorism. Taliban is committed to prevent terrorist groups from using Afghanistan as a base for external operations that could threaten the United States or our allies, including Al-Qaeda and ISIS-K. We'll hold them accountable for that. That does not mean we will rely on them. We will remain vigilant in monitoring threats. We'll maintain robust counterterrorism capabilities in the region to neutralize those threats if necessary. And we do that in places around the world where we do not have military forces on the ground. Fourth, we continue our intensive diplomacy with allies and partners. We initiated a statement joined by more than half the world's countries, over 100 countries, as well as the United Nations Security Council resolution, setting out the international community's expectations of a Taliban-led government. We expect the Taliban to ensure freedom of travel, to make good on its commitments on counterterrorism, to uphold the basic rights of the Afghan people, including women, girls, and minorities, to name a broadly representative permanent government to forswear reprisals. The legitimacy and support the Taliban seeks from the international community will depend on its conduct. We've organized contact groups of key countries to ensure the international community continues to speak with one voice on Afghanistan and to leverage our combined influence. Last week, I led a ministerial meeting of 22 countries, NATO, the EU, the United Nations, to continue to align our efforts. And fifth, we'll continue to support humanitarian aid to the Afghan people. Consistent with sanctions, this aid will not flow through the government, but rather through independent organizations like NGOs and UN agencies. Just today, we announced that the United States is providing nearly $64 million in new humanitarian assistance to the people of Afghanistan to meet critical health and nutrition needs, address the protection concerns of women, children, and minorities, to help more children, including girls, go back to school. This additional funding means the United States has provided nearly $330 million in assistance to the Afghan people this fiscal year. In Doha and Ramstein, I toured the facilities where Afghans that we evacuated are being processed before moving on to their next destinations. Here at home, I spent some time at the Dulles Expo Center, where more than 45,000 Afghans have been processed after arriving in the United States. It's remarkable remarkable to see what our diplomats, our military, and employees from other civilian agencies across the U.S. government have been able to achieve in a very short time. They've met an enormous human need. They've coordinated food, water, sanitation for thousands, tens of thousands of people. They're arranging medical care, including the delivery of babies. They're reuniting families who are separated and caring for unaccompanied minors. It's an extraordinary interagency effort and a powerful testament to the skill, the compassion, and the dedication of our people. We should all be proud of what they're doing. And as we've done throughout our history, Americans are now welcoming families from Afghanistan into our communities and helping them resettle as they start their new lives. That's something to be proud of as well. Thanks very much for listening. And with that, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member McCall, I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Blinken, for your testimony. I will now recognize members for 5 minutes, and pursuant to House rules, all time yielded is for the purposes of questioning our witness. I'll recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans. Please note that I will be strict in enforcing the 5-minute time limitation for questioner. What do I mean? I don't want members to ask questions for 5 minutes and then not leave the Secretary time to respond. So when addressing your questions, please keep in mind that the 5 minutes is for questions and answers. I'll start by recognizing myself. Mr. Secretary, you mentioned in an area of concern that I know is shared by all is the status of American citizens, green card holders, and our SIV heroes who are yet to be evacuated. Can you tell us how many of them remain in the country, and what is our plan to facilitate their evacuation now?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So as of the end of last week, we had about 100 American citizens in Afghanistan who had told us that they wished to leave the country. And I want to emphasize that this is a snapshot in time. It's more accurately a moving picture, as you know, stepping back for a minute. To know precisely at any given moment in time exactly how many American citizens are in any country is something we can't and don't know. Americans are not required to register when they go to a foreign country or if they reside there. And so from the start of this effort, we've been engaged in an intense effort to identify every American citizen that we could in Afghanistan, to be in touch with them, in contact with them, and to work with them if they wanted to leave. We've also benefited greatly from information provided by Congress to help us fill out this picture. But as of last week, there were about 100 who we were in contact with who continue to express an interest to leave. We offered seats on the planes that got out last week to about 60. 30 came forward and used those seats. What happens in at any given moment is that people are making decisions hour by hour, if not day by day, about whether to leave or not. And as I said earlier, these are incredibly wrenching decisions because for the most part, this is a community of people who've been living, residing in Afghanistan for all their lives. Afghanistan is their home. They have extended families, and it's very, very hard for them, understandably, to make that decision. But that is the group that we're working with. Now, what also happens is, as people will identify themselves, including since the end of the evacuation, as American citizens in Afghanistan who wish to leave. So they get added to the picture. We get information from you, from NGOs, from other groups, veterans groups, about people purporting to be Americans in Afghanistan. We immediately seek to contact them, to engage with them, to find out if in fact they're in Afghanistan, and if in fact they want to leave. So this is a picture that will continue to change over time, but that is the rough population that we're working with right now.
Thank you. Let me ask, next question. I know that the Trump administration's deal with the Taliban meant that there were 2,500 troops remaining with less than 5 months to complete the withdrawal. At any time, did the Biden administration consider whether to renegotiate the deal with the Taliban?
The Taliban made abundantly clear in many public statements, private statements, to us, to others around the world, that it was going to hold us to the deadline that the previous administration negotiated in terms of withdrawing the remaining American forces. It made very clear that if we moved past that deadline, it would resume the attacks that it had stopped on our forces and on our allies and partners, as well as to commence the onslaught on the cities that we've seen in recent months. And so that was exactly the choice that President Biden faced, whether to go forward with the agreement and the commitments that his predecessor had made in terms of withdrawing all forces by May 1st, or return to war with the Taliban and escalate, not end the war. Now, Mr. Chairman, as you know, what the president did do was to take some risk in extending past May 1st the time we would use to actually withdraw our forces so that we could do it in the safest and most orderly way possible.
Let me try to get in one more
he
question.
extended that deadline until September.
So also, we know that there was appointed recently in the government hardliners in the new Taliban group. Taliban's commitments to share power with other Afghan political and social groups excludes women and minorities. How does the appointment of this new government factor into the administration's strategy to engage with the Taliban, or assumptions that the Taliban may have changed?
So the interim government named by the Taliban falls very short of the mark that was set by the international community for inclusivity, that is to have a government that was broadly representative of the Afghan people, not just the Taliban and its constituency, to include women, which this interim government does not, and as has been noted, it includes many key members who have very challenging track records. We've been very clear that when it comes to engaging with that government or any government to be named on a more permanent basis, we're going to do so on the basis of whether or not it advances our interests. And those interests are very clear. They're the expectations that we've set and the international community has set for the ongoing freedom of travel, for a government that makes good on the Taliban's commitments to combat terrorism, not allow Afghanistan to be used as a haven for launching attacks directed against other countries, to support the basic rights of the Afghan people, including women and minorities, and to allow humanitarian assistance to get to people who so desperately need it. That will be the basis upon which we engage any Taliban-led government, whether it's this interim government or one they may name in the days and weeks ahead.
I now yield for questions to the Ranking Member McCall.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Secretary, in the weeks before the fall of Kabul, the surrender to the Taliban, I was on the phone with very high-ranking officials at State, DOD, White House, trying to save lives. We had Americans that couldn't get out. We had interpreters that couldn't get through the perimeter of the Taliban. They are left behind. They will be executed. They do have a bullseye on their back. We had 4 buses of Afghan girls, orphans, at the American University School of Music that sat there for 17 hours when I was finally told the State Department would not lift the gate to let them in to safety, even though they had an aircraft waiting. Will you guarantee to this committee, now we are at the mercy of the Taliban though, can you guarantee to this committee that we will get them out?
First, Ranking Member McCall, thank you for every effort that you made, as well as other members of this committee made, to help people in need, to try to help them get out. Those are deeply appreciated, and going forward, we continue to look to them. Now, I have men and women in my department, the State Department, who raised their hands from around the world and ran into the building. They went from posts around the world into that airport to help people get out. They were serving at the gates right alongside our brothers and sisters in uniform, including the 13 who gave their lives, literally trying to pull people in as necessary, or to walk them in, to talk them in, to do everything they possibly could to bring American citizens, to bring Afghans at risk, to bring the nationals of our partners and others into the airport.
If I could reclaim my time, he's just limited. And we think.
No, it's important, sir, for you to recognize.
We thank the
as well
service.
what they did.
We also thank the service, and we also thank the service of people like that worked in Operation Pineapple in Dunkirk. I would ask that the State Department work with them. Those are heroes as well as the State Department officials you're talking about. My last question, very important. Bagram went down, the embassy went down, and we went dark. We have no eyes and ears on the ground. We've lost intelligence capability in the region. That includes Russia, China, and Iran, as you know. This is a national security threat as China moves in. For all I know, they may take over Bagram Air Base. But this over-the-horizon capability, I believe, is exaggerated. It's not a viable option. It's too far away. Did you negotiate with countries like Uzbekistan or Tajikistan to put an ISR capability there? And my last question is it true that President Putin threatened the President of the United States, saying he could not build intelligence capabilities in the region?
This is an important question, and one that in its detail and substance I think we need to take up in another setting for reasons I know that you very much appreciate. Let me just say this very broadly, and you know this very well given your focus and expertise on these issues. The terrorist threat has metastasized dramatically over the last 20 years, and it's most acute in places like Yemen, like Libya, like Iraq, like Syria, like Somalia. And of course, we have much greater and different capabilities than we had 20 years ago in terms of dealing with that threat. And in many countries around the world, we deal with it effectively with no U.S. boots on the ground. We lost some capacity for sure in not having those boots on the ground in Afghanistan, but we have ways, and we are very actively working on that, to make up for that, to mitigate for that, to make sure that we have eyes on the problem, to see if it reemerges in Afghanistan. Yeah. And to do something about it. But what I would propose,
and if I could reclaim, sir, I would like to work with you, because if we can't see what's happening on the ground, we can't see the threat, we can't respond to it, the threat's only going to grow, it's going to get worse, not better, and we have to have that capability. Let me ask you one last question. We had these planes grounded at Mazar-e-Sharif, and the Taliban seems to be holding these planes up. What are you currently negotiating with the Taliban with respect to these Americans that are trying to get out on these planes? And also, are you negotiating with the Taliban on the issue of legitimizing them as a real government?
Not only us, but virtually the entire international community, including in a United Nations Security Council resolution, has made clear what we expect and will insist on from the Taliban if they want to seek any legitimacy or any support. And that includes, it starts with freedom of travel. So we've been intensely engaged with Turkey and Qatar to get the airport in Kabul up and running again, which is now the case. And we started to get flights out last week with American citizens on board. And with regard to Mazar-e-Sharif, you're correct. There have been charter flights there that have been there for some time that have not been allowed to leave. We want to see those flights leave. We need to see a process put in place to allow those flights to start to move. And we're working on that every day.
Thank you. Now yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, we've requested such a classified briefing not too long ago, and we welcome your assurance to schedule this briefing sometime in the immediate future.
Yes, absolutely.
I now recognize Representative Brad Sherman from California for 5 minutes.
Secretary Blinken, thank you for reminding us that Americans were not required to register if they were in Afghanistan, and I hope my colleagues will support my legislation to require Americans to register if they go to a war zone. The ranking member says that he never thought he'd see an unconditional surrender of the United States to the Taliban. He saw it in 2020 when President Donald Trump announced that we'd be out by May 1st of 2021, forced the release of 5,000 of the Taliban's best fighters, and most importantly, created a circumstance where there was not even a credible possibility that we would engage in force to support the Afghan government. There are those who say we should get out all of our Afghan allies and all those who face oppression or death from the Taliban. I would point out that the Afghan army, together with all of its veterans over 20 years, together with all their families, you're talking about millions of people. And while the Taliban may be harsh to the girls who are music students who are orphans, imagine how harsh they'll be to a girl whose father was in the Afghan army trying to kill the Taliban. When the administration took over, the American people made it clear we had to get out in 2021. The Afghan government, some thought, had some chance to fight to a stalemate. But by spring, those closest to us, those most in the know, were demanding visas to get out, to flee as quickly as possible. They weren't asking for guns to build trenches around Kabul to fight the Taliban. They were asking for visas. They were demanding visas. They were making videos about how they were going to be killed. When they started to flee, that started a stampede, and there is simply no way the administration could have an orderly or successful stampede. And it seems absurd, at least in retrospect, to think that the average Afghan grunt would fight in the trenches while seeing those who were best connected desperate to flee in a matter of days. Secretary Blinken, when you came into office on January 20th, we were committed to pulling everyone out of Afghanistan within 3 months, by May 1st. Did the Trump administration leave on your desk a pile of notebooks as to exactly how to carry out that plan? Did we have a list of which Afghans we were going to evacuate? Did we have a plan to get Americans from all over Afghanistan to Kabul and out in an orderly way? How meticulous was the planning for the Trump administration declared May 1st withdrawal?
Thank you, Congressman. We inherited a deadline. We did not inherit a plan.
So no plan at all. It's amazing that it wasn't much worse. It was controversial when we gave up 5 Taliban for Bergdahl, not the most meritorious of American fighting men. But the Trump administration gave 5,000 of the Taliban's top fighters back to the Taliban. What did we get for that, other than empty promises that were broken?
Congressman, the deal that the previous administration struck involved, as you rightly said, committing to remove all U.S. forces from Afghanistan by May 1st of this year. And in addition, as that deal was being negotiated and then put into effect, pressing the Afghan government to release these 5,000 prisoners, many of whom went back to the battlefield. And at the same time, in return, getting from the Taliban a few commitments. One, not to attack our forces or allied and partner forces during the time of the agreement, from the time it was reached until May 1st, when we were supposed to pull out all of our forces, as well as not to go at the major cities, and to take steps to ensure that Afghanistan would not be used by Al-Qaeda or any other terrorist group.
So, Secretary, I've got one more question. You're criticized for not getting our weapons out. Our weapons were given to the Afghan military. They were all over the country. Was there a way to disarm the Afghan government without being seen by the world as betraying the Afghan government? And was there a way without casualties to go all over Afghanistan and grab the trucks and the tanks, et cetera?
Simply put, no. Of course, a lot of excess equipment was handed over to the Afghan security and defense forces, partners that we had worked with for 20 years, supported, financed, and equipped for 20 years to take on some of that equipment. And of course, when those forces collapsed in the space of about 11 days, some of that equipment wound up in the hands of the successor forces, the Taliban. Our folks worked very hard to disable or dismantle equipment that we still controlled before we left Afghanistan. And what we see now is much of the equipment that was left behind, including in the hands of the Afghan forces that then fell to the Taliban, much of it, based on what I understand from my colleagues at DOD, is inoperable or soon will become inoperable because it has to be maintained. It's not of any great strategic value in terms of threatening us or threatening any of Afghanistan's neighbors, but it does give the Taliban, as we've seen in pictures, all of us, uniforms and guns and some other equipment that is now in their hands.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Chris Smith of New Jersey, who's the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Global Human Rights for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, you testified that you had encouraged Americans to leave the country. But, you know, simultaneous with that was statements being made, including by President Biden, that Afghans' military capability was 300,000 man strong, and that they had the best training imaginable. So, at best, I would say they were misled. And you don't mention withdrawal conditions that were placed by President Trump on any exodus from Afghanistan. But I do have a couple of questions I'd like to ask. Did you concur and support President Biden's July 23rd phone call telling President Ghani to be untruthful about the Taliban's success? According to Reuters, which reviewed both the transcript and the audio, President Biden said, quote, "And there's a need, whether it be true or not, there is a need to project a different picture." Was that an ad lib by President Biden, or was that lie scripted into the phone call? And if it was scripted, by who? Secondly, have any Americans been arrested, beaten, abducted, or killed by the Taliban or ISIS-K since we left? And do we have the capacity and the capability to know that? Third, were there any gaps or weaknesses in the vetting process of Afghan evacuees, especially in light of the fact that reliable information on some, perhaps many, who got parole wasn't available to conduct a meaningful background check? Are you concerned that the Taliban may have embedded its members as evacuees? I visited our base at Fort Dix recently with some of the other members of Congress and our governor, and asked a number of questions. But I was very concerned about the vetting, or lack thereof, and the fact that parolees, about 70% strong at our base at least, and we're going to go up to about 13,000, they can leave if they would like. They're free to leave. It's not clear whether or not they can return, but they are free to leave. And finally, one of the profoundly negative consequences outside of Afghanistan has been China and Taiwan. The state-controlled Chinese Communist Party media, including CCP-run Global Times, and I read it every day, are saturating the Taiwanese with messages to give up and surrender to Beijing, because the United States will, just as it did in Afghanistan, abandon them too. That's what the Global Times is saying. But if you could start off with the first question, I would appreciate it, and go through them.
Thanks very much, Congressman. Let me see if I can address all those questions. First, with regard to the phone call you cited, I'm obviously not going to comment on purportedly leaked transcripts of phone calls. Here's what I can tell you. What the President said in that conversation with then President Ghani is exactly what he was saying in public. And it's this, that the issue was not the capacity at that point of the Afghan government and the Afghan security forces to hold the country and to hold Kabul. It was their will and whether they had a plan to do so. And we were concerned that they were not demonstrating that will or that plan. He pressed President Ghani on the need to consolidate his forces based on the military advice from our military leaders to make sure that he could defend the places that needed defending and not overstretch those forces. And he needed to bring people together.
I understand that, but my question is about the truthfulness.
That's what he said.
I only got a few minutes.
Yeah,
whether or not it's true or not.
If I can.
Was it a real, I mean, is the transcript untrue?
Again, I'm not commenting on any purportedly leaked transcripts. I'm telling you what, based on my knowledge of the conversation the President said, and what he said is exactly what he said in public. Second, with regard to American citizens remaining behind, the ones we're in contact with, we have 500 people on a task force and teams dedicated to them to be in regular contact with them. And I have not heard from those people that concern raised. I can't say whether there are any American citizens who are not in contact with or don't know of who may have been mistreated in some fashion in Afghanistan. Third, with regard to the background checks, and this is very important, and you're right to focus on it. You know, as you know, before Afghans evacuated from Afghanistan reach the United States, they go to a transit country, and that's where the initial checks are done. We've surged Customs and Border Patrol. We've surged our intelligence and law enforcement capacity to do those initial checks. And then when they get to the United States, first at a military base, those checks are continued using all of law enforcement, intelligence, security agencies to do that, so that we can make sure that we are not letting anyone into the country who could pose a threat or a risk. It's exactly that balance that's so important as well in the SIV program. We all want to bring Afghans at risk into the United States. We also have an obligation that you rightly point out to the security of our fellow citizens. Finally, on China and Taiwan, as I said earlier, whatever protestations they may be making in newspapers or in their propaganda, there is nothing that China would have liked more than for us to have re-upped the war in Afghanistan and to remain bogged down for another 5, 10, or 20 years. That would have been profoundly against our strategic interests and profoundly in China's strategic interests. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Albio Sires of New Jersey, who's the chair of the Subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere, Civilian Security, Migration, and International Economic Policy for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being with us for the third time. And I want to also say thank you to the work that the State Department has done in getting people, including 11 members of one family that were all united and are here now in this country. So my hat is tipped off to those people who work so hard. The question that I have is, the Taliban seems to be having a complete hold in the country. But I understand there are other groups in Afghanistan. How fragile or how strong, firm is the Taliban's hold on this country? And do you see that breaking apart as everybody wants their peace down the line? Because it seems that this country is made up of pieces of people that control certain pieces of the country.
It's thank you. It's a very good question and an important one, and it is very hard to predict with any certainty. The country is, in so many ways, as you pointed out, fractured among different groups, different ethnic groups, north, south, east, and west, different outside actors that may be supporting one group or another. And so, for the Taliban to fully consolidate control, that I think that remains an open question. It's also why, ironically, it would be profoundly in the Taliban's interest to actually put forward a genuinely inclusive and representative government, because to the extent it doesn't, to the extent that everyone other than the Taliban is left out, that's only likely to, at some period in time, whether it's tomorrow, next week, next year, or thereafter, cause those who are left out to try to assert one way or another their rights and needs. So all of that, I think, is an open question at this point. One last thing I'd mention. The country itself is in desperate straits. The UN estimates that fully half the population is in need of humanitarian assistance. We have severe malnutrition, health problems, COVID-19, droughts, etc. And so there too, the Taliban has a big problem on its hands, and of course, it is generating very, very little revenue in order to deal with that. All of which, I might add, gives the international community very significant leverage and influence going forward.
I also read where they're running out of food in the next few months.
Yep, that's correct. We've seen a terrible drought, growing nutrition problems. It's one of the reasons that we think it's so important to make sure that, regardless of anything else, we and other countries find ways to continue humanitarian assistance to the people of Afghanistan. We've committed additional funds to do that. There's a pledging conference called by the United Nations that's ongoing, and we can and will do that consistent with the sanctions, consistent with our laws, by directing assistance through NGOs, through the United Nations agencies, not through the government. We need to do everything we can to make sure the people of Afghanistan don't suffer any more than is already the case.
I would like to see if we're going to help Afghanistan with food and aid, that we extract certain commitments from them before we just give them food. And the
Thank
last
you.
thing I want to,
Go ahead.
and the last thing I
Go
want
ahead,
to
please.
say, I want to commend the country of Colombia. I think they've taken thousands of Afghanistans and they're vetting them before they get here. Is that accurate?
There are a number of countries around the world that have made those commitments, that are either serving as transit countries or serving as resettlement countries, taking in Afghans as refugees. And we deeply appreciate the countries that have stood up and agreed to do that.
Thank you. I don't have any more questions, Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Representative Joe Wilson of South Carolina, who's the ranking member of the Subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and Global Counterterrorism, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Greg Meeks, and I'm glad to join with our dear colleague Albiel Series in thanking our great ally of Colombia of helping the Afghan refugees. Sir, in my service on the Foreign Affairs Committee, the Global Terrorism Subcommittee, the Armed Services Committee, the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and the Helsinki Commission, I've always been impressed by American Foreign Service diplomats worldwide. Their dedication to service is inspiring. That is why I am shocked at your actions superseding military advice, leading to the surrender in Afghanistan to be a safe haven for murderous terrorists. Biden and Harris have also opened the southern border, stopping the wall of President Donald Trump. This allows identified terrorists of the terror watch list to enter American neighborhoods as lone wolf suicide bombers to murder as many Americans as possible. In American history, American families have never been at a greater risk of attack at home than today. As the global war on terrorism is not over, it has been moved from abroad to American homes. As the grateful father of an Afghanistan veteran, I especially see your actions as indefensible. With 12 visits by me across Afghanistan to thank the South Carolina Army National Guard troops, the 218th Brigade, commanded by General Bob Livingston, I know firsthand they appreciated serving with their Afghan brothers. I saw the United States Agency for International Development success in building schools, agricultural projects, hospitals, and bridges and roads. My beliefs have been actually expressed by the New York Post editorial board on September the 1st, and that is, quote, 6 lies Joe Biden told about Afghanistan. How can any American believe anything Biden says after he's lied so blatantly? Lie. If there are American citizens left, we're going to stay until we get them out. Truth. Biden himself admits Americans remain stranded in Afghanistan. Lie. We're making the same commitment Biden said to Afghanistans who assisted America. Truth. A senior State Department official confessed to NBC News that the majority of Afghans didn't make it out of Kabul. Lie. The United States stands by its commitment that we've made to vulnerable Afghans, such as women leaders and journalists. Truth. Team Biden didn't even ensure American employed journalists made it to safety. Lie. Asked by a reporter, do you see any parallels between what happened in Vietnam? None whatsoever. Zero. Truth. Not even a month later, pictures came from Kabul of a helicopter flying over the American embassy. Lie. Biden vowed to continue to provide Afghan army with air support. Truth. In the wake of Biden's withdrawal decision, he pulled the air support, intelligence, and contractors. The Afghan militaries couldn't operate. Lie. July 8th, Biden added that the likelihood there's going to be a Taliban overrunning everything is highly unlikely. Truth. In fact, Biden knew the Taliban were overtaking the Afghan government and asked President Ghani to lie about it, whether it's true or not. Sadly, the advanced military equipment left to the terrorists, and I end the quote of that article. Sadly, the advanced military equipment left to the terrorists is comparable to all of the military equipment that we've provided to Israel since 1948. The countries who have suffered most from Islamic extremist terrorist attacks, India, Israel, and America, are endangered. They chant death to Israel, death to America. We must never forget the May 8th bombing in Kabul, where Islamic extremist terrorists slaughtered over 80 innocent young girls. You should have changed course then because of this gruesome, revealing fact. The murderers of that attack now will have a safe haven to attack American families at home. Your bizarre abandoning of Bagram airfield led directly to 13 Marines murdered in Kabul. You should resign. I yield back.
Mr. Secretary, we only had 43 seconds left of the 5 minutes, so your response, I know you will not be able to answer many of the questions that was put forward by Representative Wilson, but if you choose, you have 43 seconds of which to respond for whichever questions were asked to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me simply thank the member for his support for the men and women of the State Department. I appreciated that part of the statement. Thank you.
I now recognize Representative Jerry Connolly of Virginia, who's the president of the NATO Parliamentarian Assembly, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I guess I would say to my friend from South Carolina, if I were the member of Congress who committed one of the most grievous acts in a State of the Union address when the President of the United States, Mr. Obama, was our guest, to shout out, "You lie," I might take more care about enumerating other alleged lies in a hearing with the Secretary of State. Mr. Secretary, what we're listening to on the other side of the aisle, sadly, is sort of a salad mix of selective facts and a lot of amnesia in the salad dressing. The history of instability in Afghanistan didn't begin on August 14th of this year, did it?
It did not.
Am I correct in remembering that, in fact, you could trace direct routes to 1977, 1978, when there was a communist coup and the president of Afghanistan was assassinated in the presidential palace? Is that correct?
It is.
And 1 year later, the Soviet Union, because of that instability, decided to invade Afghanistan. Is that correct?
It is.
And 10 years later, the Soviets left Afghanistan because they had mounting and maybe really unsustainable military casualties and felt that they were engaged in a process that could not be won. Is that correct?
It is.
And meanwhile, because the United States decided once that happened, it would disengage primarily from Afghanistan, groups like the Taliban had 12 years in which to create political power. Is that correct?
It is.
And in 2001, we re-entered Afghanistan in response to the tragedy we just remembered, 20-year remembrance this week, and we rolled up the Taliban by making alliances with various militia groups in the north and moved south until they lost control of the country in that year in 2001. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And the purpose of our involvement was to defeat al-Qaeda because the Taliban were harboring this virulent terrorist group that had attacked America. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Would it be fair to say that we achieved that objective?
It would.
Would it be fair to say that, in fact, 10 years later, the leader of that group who masterminded the attacks of 9/11 was, in fact, killed by a United States specially trained military unit?
That's correct.
So what happened ultimately on August 14th has lots of history. I know it's convenient to pretend that didn't happen. And I know that we want to give ourselves sort of the pleasure of attacking a political leader of the other party. And so let me engage in that too. I'm going to assert that the events of August 14th had their direct antecedent with a bad decision by President Trump and Secretary Pompeo in 2018 to elevate and legitimize the Taliban in Doha, Qatar, by agreeing to have face-to-face negotiations. That tragedy was compounded exponentially by an unbelievable decision to exclude the government of Afghanistan, ostensibly we were defending, from those very negotiations. Is that an accurate statement, Mr. Secretary?
Certainly that's what we inherited.
But the Afghan government was in fact excluded from the negotiating table in Doha by the Trump administration. Is that not correct?
That's essentially correct, yes.
And when those 5,000 people were released from prison, since the ranking member is so concerned, and correctly so, about 2 Haqqani members in the current cabinet of the Taliban, were there any known terrorists or declared terrorists by the United States among those 5,000 people released with the consent and negotiated agreement of the Trump administration?
Almost certainly, yes.
I guess our concern about terrorists is pretty selective and limited to partisanship. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. I now recognize Representative Steve Shabbat of Ohio, who's the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and Non-Proliferation for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On August 16th, Mr. Secretary, President Biden said that the administration had considered every contingency and was executing the evacuation according to your plan. Was it part of your plan to rely on the Taliban to ensure the safety of Americans trying to flee the country? Because that's what happened.
We, through the course of the spring and summer, did indeed, as the President said, look at every contingency for dealing with our drawdown. And we relied upon the
Taliban to be our security. In essence, we ended up getting 13 of our military personnel and over 150 Afghan civilians killed by relying upon the Taliban. They didn't provide very good security. We never should have relied upon them. But let me move on my second question.
We were not relying upon the Taliban. As you know, what happened was the Afghan security forces and the government collapsed within the space of 11 days. We then executed the plans that we had in place to safely draw down our embassy, move it to the airport. The military came in, took over the airport, and started getting evacuation flights out within 72 hours. Those were the plans that were in place.
We certainly relied upon it at the airport. It didn't work out so well. Mr. Secretary, President Biden has laid the blame for the evacuation debacle in Afghanistan on others rather than on himself, where it really belongs. He blamed President Trump, as we've discussed already to some degree here, basically claiming that he was just following Trump's policy. But he hasn't hesitated to disregard every other major Trump policy, our southern border, the Keystone Pipeline, the Paris Climate Accord, the Iran deal, Mexico City policy, and on and on. Yet this was the one Trump policy that he had to follow. Do you understand why this is pretty hard to fathom for a lot of people?
I think what's perhaps, Congressman, hard to fathom, or people just don't understand, is that the agreement reached by the previous administration required all U.S. forces to be out of Afghanistan by May 1st. In return, the Taliban stopped attacking our forces, our partners, and it didn't commence an onslaught of the Afghanistan cities. Had the president not followed through on the commitments that his predecessor made, those attacks would have resumed. We would have re-upped the war in Afghanistan after 20 years for another 5, 10, or 20 years. We would have had to send more forces back in. And I recognize that a lot of people don't understand that, don't know the agreement that was reached, and the choice that President Biden faced for May 1st.
Let me ask you this. When he wasn't blaming Trump, he was blaming the Afghan military forces for allegedly not being willing to fight. But whereas we had suffered a single U.S. military death in a year and a half, and that's a wonderful thing, the Afghan military forces had lost about 3,000 of their military personnel during that same time. So wasn't the president being a little unfair to those 3,000 Afghans who lost their lives fighting the Taliban during that period of time?
Congressman, many Afghan soldiers fought with incredible bravery and gave their lives. You're right. But as an institution, after 20 years of investment by the United States, by the international community, hundreds of billions of dollars, equipment, support, training. As an institution, it collapsed in 11 days.
Mr. Secretary, we went into Afghanistan in the first place because the Taliban had harbored Al Qaeda, correct? And they attacked us on September 11th. Now, 20 years later, we have the Taliban back in charge there, and they have billions and billions of dollars worth of our equipment and our weaponry. And once again, they're a haven for terrorists. How is this not a debacle of monumental proportions?
Congressman, as we were discussing a little bit earlier, the Al-Qaeda, the group that attacked us on 9/11, long ago was vastly degraded to the point where it is currently not capable in the assessment of our intelligence agencies of conducting an externally directed attack against us or against others. The Taliban should remember as well what happened the last time it did, as you rightly said, harbor Al-Qaeda, and it engaged in an outwardly directed attack against us. It knows the consequences of continuing to do that, and it has made commitments not to allow that to happen. But of course, we're not relying on those commitments. As we discussed a little bit earlier, we are putting in place what we do in countries around the world where we don't have boots on the ground, which is an over-the-horizon capacity to detect the reemergence, should it happen, of any threat, including from Al-Qaeda, and the means to do something about it.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Ted Deutsch of Florida, who's the chair of the Subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and Global Counterterrorism, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I appreciate you being here today. And we do need to look back. This is a really important hearing, but we also need to look forward. The reality is we have a Taliban government. We have terrorist groups already surging. Potential threats to U.S. interests remain. It is true that we are not the world's policeman, but we know that a strengthened ISIS-K or Al-Qaeda pose a threat not only to the U.S. homeland, but to Americans abroad, our interests abroad, and the region. The Middle East and North Africa in particular were fundamentally changed in the aftermath of 9/11 with the rise of Al-Qaeda and ISIS affiliates. We clearly can't trust the Taliban to keep terrorists at bay. So, Mr. Secretary, you traveled to Doha to conduct diplomatic talks with partners and allies on our continued counterterrorism role. What do you assess to be the operational capacities of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan? And how is the administration planning to hold the Taliban to its commitment to ensure that Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups are unable to use Afghan soil to plan terrorist attacks on or threaten the security of the U.S. and our allies?
Thank you very much. A few things on this. First, as we were discussing a little bit earlier, as you know from your focus on this, the terrorist threat has metastasized significantly from 9/11, and it is much more acute now in terms of potential threats to the homeland and threats beyond the countries in question from Somalia, from Yemen, from Libya, Iraq, Syria, a number of other countries in Africa as well. And so we have to be able to make sure that we're focused everywhere. That's a possibility, and resourced appropriately. And we are. And in a number of those places, as you know very well, we don't have boots on the ground, but we find ways to deal with that threat, including with over-the-horizon capabilities. In the case of Afghanistan, a couple of things. The current assessment of the intelligence community is that long ago, Al-Qaeda was so significantly degraded that it's not in a position to conduct externally directed attacks. But we will remain hyper-vigilant about any reemergence of that threat. And we will be working closely with partners and other countries to be in a position to do that. I think the chairman referenced earlier that we hope and expect in the near future to be able to do some classified briefings on this, because there are a number of things that it would not be appropriate to discuss in this setting.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and we appreciate your commitment to ensuring that those classified briefings occur. Secretary Blinken, the war in Afghanistan was the first mission in the history of NATO arising out of the invocation of Article 5. There are over 50 NATO members and partner countries sent troops, 36, it's been reported, had troops there at the time of the drawdown, they invested political capital, our allies invested political capital and funds, and certainly troops. And often those troops gave their lives as well. The criticism that we've heard from some of our allies is that there was not adequate consultation and coordination with our NATO allies. We heard the Secretary General of NATO say just this week that there was. Others doubted that. I'd like you to speak to that, but finally this. We had an administration, Mr. Secretary, that wanted to go it alone, a president who failed to appreciate and often criticized the importance of NATO allies while embracing Xi and Putin. If you could also, in their final time with me, speak to, at a time when democratic values are being threatened and at risk in so many places around the world, if you could also speak to the importance of that transatlantic relationship and how to reassure those allies of ours who have raised concerns about how we went about pulling out of Afghanistan and about failing to coordinate with them as we did.
Yeah, thank you. A couple of things. First, you're so right to point to our allies and partners who stood with us on 9/11 and in all the days and time thereafter. And you're exactly right that Article 5 of NATO, an attack on one is an attack on all, in essence, was invoked for the very first time in its history in our defense by our allies and partners, something that I will never forget, and I suspect no one on this video conference today will ever forget. And we determined that when it came to Afghanistan, we went in together and we would go out together. And that's exactly what we did. I engaged with the Secretary of Defense in intense consultations with our NATO partners well before the President made his decision, going to Brussels for a special session of the North Atlantic Council and listening intently to every single partner, relaying what we heard directly to President Biden to factor that into our thinking and into our planning. I've spent more time in Brussels, either in person or virtually, than in any other place since I've been on this job, working very closely with these allies and partners. On the day that the President's decision was announced, I was back in Brussels with the Secretary of Defense. And NATO immediately and unanimously endorsed that decision. Now, in the discussions and conversations that we had throughout this time, including individual conversations, people brought various perspectives to the table, but each recognized that given the deadline that existed, that is, that our forces had to depart Afghanistan by May 1st, pursuant to the agreement negotiated by the previous administration, that the alternative, should we choose to stay, was for the Taliban to resume attacks, not just on us, but on our NATO partners and allies, as well as to engage in this countrywide offensive that we've seen to retake the major cities, in effect, to re-up the war. And all unanimously endorsed the proposition that we would leave together, and that's exactly what we worked on doing and what we've been doing. I know from talking to many allies and partners, the tremendous solidarity we saw together at the Kabul airport, working to help each other to make sure that we could get out our fellow nationals, Afghans who had helped each of us, and our embassy personnel. I heard a lot of gratitude from allies and partners about the work that our folks did in making sure that we could deliver on that commitment to them. So from my perspective, at least, there was tremendous and genuine consultation with allies and partners throughout this process. And going forward, right now, we are deeply engaged with them at NATO and in other organizations on working together on the way forward to collectively hold the Taliban to the commitments that it's made to the international community.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Scott Perry of Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Blinken, assuming it's not classified, can you tell us where you are today?
Yes, I'm at the State Department.
Oh, couldn't be bothered to come down here and see Congress. All right, that's great. Hey,
Sir, excuse me, sir. My understanding is that the House is not in session, and that's why the session has been.
I'm right here, Secretary. Says the chairman. Says the ranking member. We're here, Mr. Chairman. Reclaiming my time. Did state at any point in the evacuation process block American citizens from leaving Afghanistan?
No, we did not.
None. Your testimony before Congress is that state didn't block any American citizens leaving
To the
Afghanistan.
contrary, my officers, men and women, ran into the building from around the world to help
It's
Americans
a simple
get out.
yes or no. I
And
heard you do it with Mr. Connolly. You can do it with me. Yes or no? I just want to clarify. You didn't block anybody. State didn't block any American citizens.
No,
Okay.
they were there to help
All
Americans
right.
get out.
How many Afghans
yeah.
not meeting the qualifications of SIV have been brought to the United States? Prior to, I want to
Go
know
ahead,
how
please.
many
Go
Afghan
ahead.
citizens came to the United States that had not met the qualifications for special immigrant visa.
We're in the process of
No. How
going
many?
through.
How many? How many did you bring? You were just at Dulles. How many did you bring?
We will have, by the end of the month, we will have brought a total of approximately 60,000.
That have not met the
to the United
SIV
States.
process.
Some
Standard.
of those will have been through the SIV process. All of them, regardless of SIV status, will have gone through rigorous security checks, first at the transit
It'd be
points
nice if
outside
we,
of the United
it'd be
States,
nice
and
if
then
that was
in
done
the United
before we
States.
brought these people to the United States of America. Mr. Secretary, are Afghan refugees required to be vaccinated for COVID before coming to the United States of America?
They are vaccinated in the United States before they are resettled into the United States.
There are none of these Afghan citizens that are allowed to leave these resettlement communities, Fort Dix, Dulles, et cetera, that are allowed to leave at any time they want. None of them are leaving unless they are vaccinated for COVID. Is that your testimony?
They're tested for COVID and vaccinated for COVID.
Vaccinated before they leave?
That's my understanding.
All right, thank you, Mr. Secretary. Is it the policy of the United States of America to take hard-earned tax dollars and pay terrorist organizations?
It is not.
It is not. So your testimony earlier is that we're sending taxpayer dollars to Afghanistan right now for humanitarian relief. Who are we sending that to?
To NGOs and to the United Nations agencies who are using that assistance, not to the Afghan government.
Not to the Afghan, the Taliban government. How are you accounting for that? How are you making sure that the Taliban government is not receiving that?
As we do around the world in places of conflict where we provide humanitarian assistance, working through UN, working through NGOs with long-tested methods to make sure that the assistance provided goes to the people who need it, not to the government in question.
Is it your understanding that over the past 20 years, the United States taxpayers have paid Pakistan, who has then used that money to support the Taliban, the Haqqani Network, ISIS-K, Khorasan Group, et cetera, for the past 20 years? Is that not true?
There's a long history that we should all look at together.
Right.
About the involvement of Pakistan.
So I would say that we should no longer pay Pakistan and we should pay India. Let me ask you this. I just have a couple more questions for you. A little off topic here, but I think it's interesting. How long was your recent interview with the FBI, and was it a deposition?
I'm sorry, I don't know what you're referring.
Are you saying that you have not had a recent interview with the FBI since becoming Secretary of State?
I'm not sure what you're referring to, and I'm happy to take that up with you offline.
Did the State Department turn over documents to the FBI related to Hunter Biden, Burisma, and/or the Blue State Strategies Corporation?
You'll have to.
So you have no knowledge of this. You have had no. You don't. Are you saying you have not had an interview with the FBI since becoming Secretary of State?
It would not be appropriate for me to comment in a public forum on any legal proceedings that the department.
I'm not asking you to cooperate. I'm not asking you to comment on the legal proceedings. I'm just asking if you've been interviewed by the FBI since becoming Secretary of State.
Again, I'm not going to comment one way or another on any legal proceedings or not that may or may not have happened.
Have you sought to?
Let me remind the gentleman that the topic of this hearing is Afghanistan. That's what we're.
I appreciate it, Mr. Chairman, but the Secretary generally refuses to answer questions about Afghanistan, so I just figured we'd talk about something he should be intimately familiar with. Have you sought to alter any of your testimony from last year's Senate investigation regarding this topic? Mr. Secretary.
Gentleman's time has expired. And let me also, for the record, make clear that this is a hybrid hearing. Just as members had an option to come or to be other places, the Secretary also. It's a hybrid hearing because we are not in session.
Mr. Chairman, point of inquiry, if I could.
Who seeks
This is
recognition?
Congressman Issa. Just for my edification, was it expressed to the Secretary that he had a choice of either one, or was he invited to come here, or was he alerted to remain there? And I only ask because I think we all agree that if he could have been here in person, it would have been better. But if it was an option or for whatever reason, because I want to make sure that it's clear that the Secretary may have done no wrong, even though many of us would prefer him to be here. So,
Secretary has done no wrong. It was an option, and I made it as an option as I've done with every member.
okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I now recognize Representative Karen Bass of California, who's the chair of the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Global Human Rights for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Secretary Blinken, for attending this hearing and for your patience with putting up with the theatrics of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. I want to thank you again for spending the time and agreeing to take everyone's questions for 5 minutes. The departure from Afghanistan has provided really unprecedented insight into our foreign policy. In addition to demonstrating the bravery, dedication, and professionalism of our military, diplomats, and Afghan partners, it has also shown how a 20-year effort and billions of dollars have really raised questions about what the return of investment is that we desired in terms of sustaining peace and stability in Afghanistan. The assumption of power by the Taliban has secondary and tertiary effects on the most vulnerable segments of the population, especially women and children. And we're concerned that it will reverse any gains that were realized in the last 2 decades. So my first question, yes or no, Mr. Secretary, did the agreement from the last administration include any protections for girls and women?
Not to my knowledge.
So many people are concerned about the status of women and girls in Afghanistan under the Taliban. The restrictions on education, movement, health, physical safety under their regime paints a grim picture. I'd like to know how the administration will work with partners to support advocacy for women's rights and the rights of ethnic and religious minorities in Afghanistan.
Here's what I found.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Congresswoman. One of the truly great achievements of the last 20 years was the progress made by women and girls in particular in Afghanistan. And one of the things that we should be proud of is the support, the leading support that we gave to that when it comes to access to education, to healthcare, to the workforce, entrepreneurship. Those gains were significant, and we were the leading contributor. I was in Kabul in April. I sat with a number of women who had benefited from our assistance, including women who'd gone on to become leaders in their parliament, in the media, NGOs, et cetera, and of course heard their profound concerns about the future. Just recently, when I was in Doha and at Ramstein, talking to people who'd been evacuated from Afghanistan, I spoke to a lot of women and girls and heard their deep concerns about the future, as well as people who are still in Afghanistan. And so we have an ongoing commitment to use every tool at our disposal through our diplomacy, through our economic assistance, humanitarian assistance,